Our next section focuses on assessments that are conducted in the workplace. I'll hand over to Nita for the first question.
Judith, some RTOs deliver and collect evidence in the workplace. And, you know, that often happens with trade apprenticeships in the cookery area, early childhood, many. How does an RTO develop an assessment tool and outline the context and the conditions of the assessment while still enabling that tool to be fair and considerate of the individual needs of the assessment process?
Nita, as you've correctly identified, many training packages do actually specify what we refer to as the context and the conditions of the assessment. The context being where or the environment in which assessment must occur, and the conditions of assessment being the characteristics of that environment. So for example, in relation to hospitality qualifications, there's often requirements around staff customer ratios, and in relation to early childhood, the context of assessment, for some units of competency, it's specified that assessment must occur in a regulated education and care service, and the conditions of assessment must specify, for example, that the candidate must work with young children of particular ages. So it is very important that in designing and developing assessment tools, that the RTO is cognizant of those requirements. Where assessment occurs within the workplace, the assessment tool or the assessment system must allow the assessor to actually demonstrate that those requirements have in fact been met, and where there are multiple types of environments in which students may undertake their assessment or a simulated environment, there must also be evidence that that simulated environment or the alternative environment has actually satisfied the context or the conditions. Earlier, Anne referred to realistic simulation. So in terms of where there's flexibility for assessment to occur outside of the workplace, but in an environment that's a simulated environment that simulates the workplace, it may be important for the registered training organisation to involve industry in determining whether or not that simulated environment is in fact realistic and does in fact simulate realistic industry conditions. Because at the end of the day, that's what many of these training products are actually preparing students for, is to actually work in industry, to work in the real environment, to be able to perform tasks in the real environment. So the assessment environment does actually need to reflect those industry requirements, and the assessment system needs to gather evidence that those requirements have in fact been addressed through the assessment process. Some of the common issues that we see as auditors with regard to the gathering of evidence in the workplace include inadequate workplace inspection or selection of equipment prior to conducting the assessment. That is, the workplace environment doesn't necessarily have all of the resources that are required, or that the resources are not of the current industry standard. We also sometimes see instances where the workplace supervisor is actually signing off students as competent. That in fact is the role of the assessor, and evidence gathered in the workplace may form supplementary evidence, but is the qualified assessor who should in fact be making that determination of competence based on the evidence that may be gathered through the workplace and through other assessment tasks completed by students.
Thanks, Judith. So at audit, you would expect to see the RTO's evidence where they have deemed a workplace as suitable to conduct that assessment, including having all the different components the student needs to use to demonstrate the skills and knowledge.
Yes, that's correct. And that should be determined before the assessment occurs. In Nita's opening statement, she referred to apprenticeships and traineeships, I think. So with regards to, students in the workplace, that assessment is actually often made before the student even commences training. But one of the issues with assessment is actually ensuring the availability of those resources for assessment purposes. So as part of that process of reviewing the resources that are available for the purpose of both training and assessment, is identifying when those resources are available and confirming that they will be available at the time that they are required for assessment and in sufficient quantity to actually complete the assessment as well. One example that I can give from the early childhood area is in relation to the early childhood qualifications where, as I mentioned, students often are required to demonstrate their competency in regulated education and care services. Now, not all regulated education and care services may be able to provide students with access to children of the full age range required to satisfy the requirements of some units of competency. So it may be, for example, that a student needs to complete that unit of competency or complete assessment tasks related to that unit of competency across multiple workplaces in order to meet the requirements of the unit.